Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. I'm Dr. Allison Norton, co-director of Hartford Institute for Religion Research here at Hartford International University. For more than 40 years, Hartford Institute has engaged in rigorous research for religious leaders and faith bodies, anticipating emerging issues and creatively disseminating our findings. Currently, we are in the last year of a 5-year research project exploring the pandemic impact on congregations. And we're studying the changes and possible long-term implications of COVID-19 on religious life across the US. So we're really excited to welcome you here today to join the conversation on what we are learning from our recent survey of over 24,000 attenders, and hopefully having some conversation about how these key findings may be relevant and useful in your ministry context. So as questions arise throughout this webinar, feel free to use the Q&A feature here in Zoom to ask questions, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. So I'm going to introduce our presenters. We're going to hear from the two authors of this report, starting with Dr. Scott Thuma and then Dr. Carissa McCoskey. So Scott Thuma is director of Hartford Institute here and also professor of sociology of religion. Dr. Carissa McCoskey is assistant professor of research here on the HIRR team. So over to both of you.
Thank you very much, Allison. Hello and good day to everybody. Thanks for being with us. Carissa and I, as Allison said, are going to share a bit today from our latest EPIC survey that's exploring the pandemic impact on congregations. We call it EPIC. And in this presentation, we're going to cover some of that. So this is primarily a survey of what we found so far from our survey of church attenders that we collected this past fall and winter. On Monday, we released our overview summary report, and I'd encourage everybody to take a look at that. The full data set of this survey has an enormous amount to explore, and definitely more than we can cover in this hour or so. So we're going to be releasing additional reports from the data in the coming months of this year. We hope to go deeper into several segments and explore some additional dimensions of this large and very interesting survey. Yeah, I'm not able to advance the slides. Actually, there we go. Sorry for that. So this survey and the EPIC project as a whole is really a team effort. Those of us on the screen you see for sure are part of it, but there's also other postdoctoral fellows and roughly about 40 other researchers throughout the country, including several I know who have tuned into this webinar. So also let me give a shout out to a number of the clergy and perhaps some of the church attenders who helped us by taking this survey. We thank you so much for doing that. Today, we want to quickly summarize a few of the congregational results and then focus on the attender survey. Overall, this project has had many different parts and is a multifaceted picture of how religious organizations have adapted to a post-pandemic reality. The attender survey that we're going to talk about is different from our other data in a few key ways. First, as you can tell, it's pretty huge. We have more than 24,000 respondents. Second, and this is very important, it's a survey of attenders. Up to this point, EPIC and faith communities today as a whole has been mostly surveying congregations by asking one representative of that congregation, usually the clergy person, to complete a survey about the church as a whole. This survey, however, asked people in the pews about their take on how things have evolved. So I said most of the EPIC study has looked at it from the perspective of the congregation and clergy. So before we get into the attender data, let me recap a bit of what we've found so far. And let me preface that with this picture does look different from what the attender perspective found because it includes vastly more congregations of all different sizes, many churches that are struggling and some that are facing challenging situations. So the first point I want to make from some of that data, and I always remind folks of this when giving a presentation, is that church attenders are not equally distributed across all of the roughly 350,000 congregations in the US. There's a significant size and attendance inequity across these congregations. The larger ones, those over 250 people in weekly service attendance, have about 70% of all of the people who regularly attend. However, nearly 70% of the US churches share only about 14% of the people who attend. This is a major imbalance. Um, while it's not quite as significant as the monetary distribution in the US, it's nevertheless, I think, really challenging. And you can see the difference here with the red bars representing where the attenders are, and the blue bars, the percent of the number of congregations in the country. So large churches are big, and they're most likely to be getting bigger. And conversely, the congregations between about 50 and 250 are most likely to be getting smaller. So what that means is about 35,000 congregations in the country have about 3/4 of the worshipers. And that means that 3/4 of the people who are in church have a fairly robust experience. But 70% of churches and pastors are having maybe a little bit more challenging existence. So keep that in mind when you hear us talk in this presentation. It's predominantly from people who are in those larger, over 250 person churches. And size does make a big difference in terms of congregational dynamics and in attender perceptions. So to summarize all that, most churches are small, but most church attenders are in larger churches. In addition to the size distribution, another significant trend that we're tracking are changes in the in-person worship service attendance. Worship attendance has been in decline for several decades. The median number of people in worship on Sundays is down from 137 in 2000 to about 60 in 2023. And this downward trend had started long before the pandemic, but it really took a hit during the height of the pandemic and has rebounded a little, indicating that pandemic decline wasn't necessarily permanent. But it's still not back to the figure of 65 people median in worship that it was just prior to the pandemic. But if you include online attenders, the median bumps up to about 75 people per congregation, which recovers some of the losses. But we often hesitate to count those for a number of reasons. One, clergy struggle to accurately count those people, and they're not physically in the room, thus they're more or less invisible to other participants. And the online folks are a whole different reality from the in-person people, as Carissa will unpack in a little bit. Other congregational level trends that we're seeing in our research include the fact that the median age of people participating in congregations continues to rise. They're getting older, as are the clergy ages. Not too surprising, more congregations are offering online worship options, and that's likely to continue into the future. And also not surprising, tech use by congregations overall has increased over the last 5 years. But interestingly, church programming, other than worship services, has been in decline. There are fewer congregations offering certain programming than there were 5 years ago. We've also found that the congregation's willingness to change, to meet new challenges, was not surprisingly up a good bit during the pandemic. But since that time, we're now seeing the willingness of these churches to change to dip below where it was in pre-pandemic time. And that's a worrisome trend. Congregational income is up, but as with everything else in our society, it's not keeping pace with inflation. But there are some bright spots. Volunteering has rebounded after some very difficult times during the pandemic, and serious conflict among congregations is down. And overall, most leaders, and we'll see most attenders, have a pretty positive view of their church's future. Now, we've reported on these trends and many other findings from the congregational level, and it's all in research reports that you can read that we've posted on our website, covidreligionresearch.org. But now let me move to the reason you're here, and that is to hear about our new attender results. So as we've said, we collected over 24,000 responses from more than 80 different Christian denominations in the fall and winter of 2024. And we gathered this data in a couple different ways. Over half the responses came from our partnership called Faith Communities Today, which is a group of 12 denominations, and we've essentially surveyed their congregations and asked the pastors to distribute our survey to their members. And we, as I said, we got more than half the responses that way. The rest are from two different paid external panels, one from Prolific and the other one from SurveyMonkey. Then once we gathered all that data, we designed some weights to adjust the sample based on denomination and on church size to try to match as closely as possible the national profiles that we see in other organizations like Pew and the National Congregation Study and Faith Communities Today and other surveys. So overall, we feel pretty confident that this is describing the kinds of people that we would see most often in a congregation. So now let's turn to a few of the demographic characteristics of this sample. We see that about 61% are women, about 3/4 are white race, about 10% are immigrants, and 1/4 are children of immigrants. The median age of attenders is 52. About 2/3 have the bachelor's degree or higher. The total household income, 40% of our sample is over 100,000. About 2/3 are married. 30% or so are living with a child or children at home. 1/3 are in the South, 1/4 are from the Northeast. About half are Republicans, 34% are Democrats, 11% independents, and most are relatively healthy, and nearly all of them say that faith is very important to their daily life. Now, looked at a slightly different way, the characteristics of the churches that these folks attend, not too surprising, as I've emphasized, about 71% of them attend a large church. And by that, I mean more than 250 attenders in worship. And as I said, this is important to remember because size is very significant in terms of the demographics and that sort of thing. If you recall from my first graphic, most churches are small, but most people are in large churches. Not only that, 50% of our sample attend an evangelical Protestant church. About 1/3 attend Catholic or Orthodox congregations, and the rest attend a mainline Protestant church. 85% of our attenders are in churches that offer online worship options. 19% are in a multiracial congregation, and 83% are in a church that stopped meeting in person due to COVID. 90% have a man as the clergy leader, and most attenders maybe stretch the truth and say there's a very good fit between the clergy leader and the congregation. Additionally, the majority of attenders has been at their church since before the pandemic, and almost half for over 10 years. But in some ways, surprising, over a third, 38%, have come since 2020. So in some ways, this seems high to me, given that clergy, when we survey them, they usually report that they gain about 5% of new people a year. So the question is, did the pandemic kind of create an increase? And maybe there is a slight uptick, but it's not the great revival or awakening that some people predicted early in COVID. We are going to be conducting another congregational survey this fall with our Faith Communities Today partners, and hopefully we'll get a better idea of the full impact of the past 5 years. So now let me hand over the presentation to my colleague Carissa to offer some more detailed look at our findings.
Thank you, Scott. So I'm going to summarize several of the highlights from this new report, but there's a lot more that we go into in the pages of the report that we're not able to fit here. So as Scott said, I encourage you to take a look at the full report when you have a moment. So to begin right now, let's talk about markers of commitment, engagement, and involvement with the congregation and how these have changed over the past 5 years. Specifically, we look at worship service attendance, participation in other congregational activities, volunteering in the congregation, and making financial donations to the congregation, each of which captures a portion of what it means to be an active participant in a congregation today. So we find that most respondents have either maintained, which is the green section of each pie chart here, or increased, the dark blue sections, their worship service attendance, volunteering at the congregation, and giving financially to their congregation over the past 5 years. Only a small number of attenders have decreased these behaviors in the past few years. And the behavior with the biggest increase is financial giving, which was asked as a percentage of the respondents' annual income, not as just total dollars. This trend of maintaining or increasing also holds true for participation in other activities like religious education, music programs, small group activities, and community service or social justice initiatives. However, there is likely a survival effect at play here in these numbers, in that people who have decreased may not be around the church at all anymore and therefore would not be captured in this survey. But the people who are currently attending look as committed and faithful as ever. Other key findings related to these commitment metrics include that 64% attend services weekly or more, and another 20% come 2 to 3 times a month. 50% volunteer monthly or more in their congregation. 93% say that they financially contribute to their congregation, and about half of them report giving at least 5% of their annual income. And not only are these attenders engaged in collective religious behaviors, but they also regularly engage in personal religious practices. For example, 88% say that they pray at least weekly, and 2/3 say that they read scripture at least weekly. So for most participants, their faith is an everyday, lived and practiced spiritual reality.
Thanks, Carissa. One of the things that we included in the report were questions for church leadership to wrestle with regarding the implications of our findings. we'll have ample time later for questions and discussions in a bit, but take a moment to reflect on what you just heard. Have you seen significant changes in who attends and how much they attend? And how are you responding to some of these changes? What have you had to do to address the new people that have come in or the shifting levels of commitment and volunteering and who's volunteering? Think about some of these questions, and we can talk further about that as we go along. Okay, back to you, Carissa.
So as Scott mentioned earlier, we found that about 38% of respondents from this survey have only been with their congregation for the past 5 years or less. So this means that they all started with their current church during the pandemic period or in the years since. So we wanted to know more about this group of people specifically. First, where did they come from and what was their previous connection to a church? We found that about 70% of the new people participated in another congregation before they came to their current one. Now, this intercongregation switching has long been the primary metric by which congregations grow, so this is to be expected. But more interestingly, 22% of these new attenders had not attended a congregation for years. So they are returners or rechurched after a lapse in participation, people who fell away for whatever reason and are now back to corporate worship. And 8% of these new attenders report never attending a congregation before. So they are perhaps converted religious nuns or what we are going to refer to as congregational converts. We also wanted to know what brought these new attenders to their current congregation. The most important factor, with nearly 2/3 of these folks saying that it was very important, is that the church aligns with their beliefs, values, and preferences. And this was even more important for the people who switched right at the start of the pandemic period. So this is consistent with discussions that took place early in the pandemic about people sorting themselves into congregations based on finding a congregation that was more congruent with their views about how to address the public health crisis or their personal political views. The next most influential factors are welcoming atmosphere, the worship experience, and denominational or faith group ties. Lower on the list are factors like location, having family or friends as part of the congregation, and the reputation of the church or its clergy leader, which have historically been some of the most important reasons people have selected their church. Demographically, we find that this group of new attenders was more likely to be younger than the longer-term attenders and more likely to attend online. Also, while they attend less frequently than the long-term folks, they are more likely to be increasing their participation and attendance over the past 5 years, which makes sense since 3 in 10 of them were previously unconnected to a congregation. But not only that, but there are some interesting differences between the 3 groups of new attenders. For example, the congregational converts are more likely to be men, single, immigrants, they're younger, they're more likely to be non-white racial categories, whereas the returners are more likely to have increased their volunteering and have a strong desire for belonging despite feeling more disconnected. And the switchers, who just came from a different congregation to the one they're at now, are more likely to have changed early in the pandemic time period, be married, have children, and they look more similar to the long-term attenders on a variety of metrics. So this suggests that each group has a different set of needs. The first group may need more spiritual training and mentorship. The second group needs help making connections and finding community. And the third group just needs to be more fully incorporated into the life of the church.
You know, these new people fascinate me and bring to mind all sorts of other questions about what's going on here. And I hope that's true for you as well. Did you find a sizable influx of new people, or conversely, Did you find that some of your folks switched out either to a nun or to another congregation? And if you did get some of these new folks, how do they resemble or not your prior congregational makeup? I think interestingly, think about what the church was like when these new people entered 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. And has that reality that they came into remained, or has the church reverted to something different than what the new attenders came for? They might not even recognize the congregation now because it's drifted back to something that they didn't know. Uh, so how would you think about addressing the needs of both these newer people and then also the longer term participants without losing some of both groups? These are really challenging issues, I think.
Another group we wanted to explore in more detail is the people who attend worship services online. So what we found in our previous congregation level surveys is that one of the biggest changes congregations made during the pandemic was that most started offering online worship options, and many of those are planning to continue providing online worship into the future. So we wanted to find out what is happening on the other side of the screen and dig into the experience of online worshipers from that attender's side of the screen. About 26% of the respondents report that they attend worship online. About 19%, however, are people who mix their participation between in-person and online, what we're calling dual format attenders. Only 7% are exclusively or primarily online attenders. A big question we wanted to dig into is, what do these online attenders do during the service? Are they passive observers, or are they engaged participants during that service time? We find that 2/3 are doing other activities during the service. Think things like cooking, driving, or even shopping in Costco, like one of our case study participants admitted to doing. However, a large majority also report praying, reading, and singing along with the elements of the service. And multitasking does not preclude people from also doing these elements of the worship service. Other findings related to the online attenders include that most people who watch the services this way do so out of convenience, followed by illness or being a caregiver for someone else, issues related to accessibility, and then concerns about COVID. And then lower on the list were issues related to work schedules, family commitments, travel out of town, and so on. A common challenge related to online worshipers is how to count them. Is each connection one person, two people, perhaps a family of 5? So to get at this, we asked the online respondents who they are participating with, and found that about half are watching by themselves, and the other half are watching with other people, including about 28% who report watching with children present with them during the service. Also, we find a few demographic differences between the online attenders, such as the dual format attenders are more likely to be families with young children who have increased their participation overall in the past 5 years. This group may have previously skipped some Sundays before the availability of online worship, but now they can tune into the service virtually if they cannot get there physically. The dual format attenders are also younger, more diverse, more likely to be married, never married, and lower on commitment metrics like volunteering and financial giving as compared to their in-person counterparts. On the other hand, the folks who are worshiping exclusively or primarily online are more likely to be older adults, more likely to be homebound, and more committed to their congregation, but physically limited in their ability to get to the church building. And overall, almost all online attenders are satisfied or very satisfied with their online worship experience. So to summarize, even though only a small percentage of people are using the online worship options, Most who are doing it find meaningful ways to engage with the service and find it enjoyable.
That's really fascinating, Carissa. You don't often get to see behind the screen and know what's happening there. And so this online worship attenders are another kind of new reality for many congregations. Uh, Even though some of those worship attenders may have been with your congregation for decades, or maybe they were only sporadic participants, but others are completely new and they're maybe just spectating. Uh, what do you really know about this audience? Have you really attempted to try to understand who they are? Why are they participating in this manner over coming in person? Are you adapting to extend hospitality to these folks, to provide them a full and rich worship experience, or just stream the service as a necessary obligation and sometimes inconvenience? Do you consider your virtual participants an actual part of your congregation or just a number to augment your attendance data? These questions really need to be addressed, I think, now in this new reality.
So building off the availability of online worship, we were curious if the increased opportunity for easy, risk-free shopping between congregations resulted in more people participating in more than one congregation at a time. So this is something that rarely, if ever, gets asked because it used to be assumed that one person was a member of only one church. But is that accurate? We found that 46% of attenders were regularly participating in other congregations, including going in person, virtually, or both, beyond the one that they were answering the survey about. So this behavior may be made easier with the recent uptick in the availability of online worship options, but still 36%, the dark blue and light blue combined, said that they do this other regular participation in person. And we also asked about having more than one church home and found that about 7% of respondents say that the church they answered the survey about was their church home, but they also had another church home. So this idea of having one church home is a fixture of a previous decade that may or may not hold up as society evolves. So while this is not a majority, and we don't know if this figure has increased over time, because as I just said, it hasn't really been asked before, it's clearly a reality that is going on right now, has not been taken into account before, and should be tracked into the future. Interestingly, we find that having more than one church home showed lower commitment levels when looking at things like attendance and giving, but participating regularly in other congregations did not have the same effect. So it appears that tuning into other services is an extra dose of religion throughout the week, whereas having more than one church home means a person is splitting their time, attention, and resources.
So needless to say, we're highlighting in this report the dynamics that fascinate us the most. But we also highlight it because we think these are challenging realities for religious leaders and congregations as well. So I question you, have you experienced any tensions with attenders who have multiple loyalties or are bringing their experiences with other churches into your situation and perhaps asking different kinds of questions? And then what about your snowbirds that possibly have two different church homes? Or with so many churches now with online services, it makes these window shopping comparisons so much easier. So do you also have to step up your game to rise to some of those alternative perspectives that they're seeing? Have you leaned into this dynamic maybe by creating partnerships or sharing resources, even encouraging your people to augment their spiritual lives with your colleagues' educational offerings? So long as their monetary offerings stay with your church, things should be okay, right? But it does create a different dynamic again post-pandemic. Back to you, Carissa.
So the last section that I will cover is we asked about some of the direct impacts of the pandemic to see what role the COVID-19 pandemic played in the faith lives of attenders and their views of their congregations. First, we explicitly asked respondents how the pandemic impacted their faith, spirituality, and sense of optimism of people of faith working together across differences. For each one, more than half of the respondents reported the pandemic made these things stronger, seen in the light green and yellowish orange on the right-hand side of this graph. And another large chunk reported no influence, the light blue segments of this graph. Only a small handful said that these were made weaker by the pandemic. And the item with the most respondents reported a weakening is the sense of optimism about people of faith working together across differences. Regarding the role of their congregation, nearly half of respondents have a stronger sense of their spiritual needs being met by their congregation, a stronger sense of belonging to their congregation, and stronger trust in their congregational leaders to make good decisions as a result of the pandemic. Additionally, only 21% of respondents feel that the pandemic caused conflict within their congregation. Further, most respondents did not feel disconnected from their congregation during the pandemic period. Only about a quarter felt disconnected, while more than double that did not. And along the same lines, 77% of attenders felt supported by their congregation during the pandemic, and only 7% disagreed. And a large majority of attenders report being pleased with how their congregation adapted in response to the pandemic, whatever that may have been. And finally, to conclude, when asked for a holistic assessment of their congregation's vitality and strength now compared to pre-pandemic, the responses from attenders are mostly positive. Only about a quarter report that their congregation is weaker now, which is on par with what we see from the leader's perspective in our other surveys. But on the whole, most attenders think that their church was either unaffected by or came out stronger from the pandemic.
So this really gets to the heart of our EPIC project overall, and that is what changes did the pandemic create in your congregation? So I ask you that as well. How did things change if they did? Did its sense of community, the way things get done, the sense of morale and expectations for the future alter since the pandemic over the last 5 years? And if the pandemic could be seen as a collective trauma that we all suffered, have you and your congregation as a whole worked through some of that trauma? Or did you, like most congregations, just stuff that trauma in a closet and shut the door and move on? These are things I think to ponder and to discuss not only with us now in the Q&A, but also as you play with these ideas in your own congregations. So you've heard a good many of the more interesting results from our survey, but wait, there's more. We do intend to release a number of additional reports throughout the year that go deeper into some of these aforementioned topics, but also material that we haven't discussed yet, like alternative spiritual practices that people are doing, or the reasons they give for volunteering and for giving, their health and wellness of attenders. And my favorite, I think, is going to be how the clergy responses that we got compare to the responses of their members. That's going to be fascinating to look at. But with 24,000 responses, we're able to delve pretty deeply into all sorts of patterns within these findings. So stay tuned, sign up for our newsletter if you're not signed up already. And there's going to be a lot more interesting stuff that we release. But now let me pass it back to Allison, who's going to moderate our Q&A. Make sure to post your questions, and I look forward to making up some answers for you. Anyway, thanks a lot.
Well, I look forward to hearing the answers too. So I did promise a lot of time for Q&A, and so we do have about 30 minutes here to dive into some of your questions that have already been coming in, and you can continue to post them in the Q&A feature, and we will try to either answer them live or do text answer responses throughout this time. So we have some great questions coming in. I want to start with Dr. Christina Lizardi-Hodgeby's question here, because Scott, you referenced something early on about this is not the next Great Awakening, but thinking about how you started, and I'm going to read Christina's question here. Given all of the research regarding the decline of congregational participation over the past several decades, does your research suggest that we may be experiencing a renaissance in church attendance, albeit in different forms than we have seen historically due to COVID-19? In other words, do you think this trend will increase over time?
Yeah, that's the question. So let me make up some answers. No, I mean, it is, at least it seems to me that it's pretty clear. The pandemic did drive some people to consider more meaningful questions, their end of life, what's significant to me. It also challenged people to think about, is this the right congregation for me? Or maybe a different one really fits my needs and interests better. So I think there was some shuffling around, but also people did say, maybe I need to go back to get some sense of community, some sense of meaning and purpose in my life. However, I don't think it's a significant uptick. If 5% a year is the average, this might be 6 or 7% a year, which does ultimately add up. But as many of our colleagues, Christina, in sociology of religion have also noted, the culture overall is adverse to a religious reality, which is part of the reason why we asked some other alternative spiritual practices. So I'm not seeing it as a revival, but there is some increase in church attendance. And the interesting thing that our data paralleled Pew's data, that's fewer young women and women are joining percentage-wise now than they were before, and a slightly higher percentage of young men. So that's an interesting dynamic to be watching.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Yeah, let's go to Robert Miller's question, because I think he raises an important one about the difference between some of our research that's focused on the congregation as a unit of analysis versus looking at the attender themselves. And so then these overall results, right, do tend to then have more respondents that are in the larger churches. So Robert Miller asks, what are some of the bigger differences between how small versus sort of large church, right, respondents engage in this?
Yeah, I'll let Carissa answer that because I study megachurches. No.
Yeah, so as Scott was mentioning earlier, that we know from our previous work in the pandemic project at the congregational level that church size really made a difference, that larger churches were better prepared for the pandemic in terms of technology access, already having perhaps live streaming as part of their regular practice. So we knew that was going to be in effect. And interestingly, some of the things we specifically find about the size differences is that for the smaller churches, they were more likely to have converts and returners, whereas the large churches were more likely to have switchers in that new folks group. And then also The small church participants had the highest sense of connection during the pandemic, which I think is pretty interesting. But I could see how that works, where when you're a small knit group and everyone knows everyone, it's a lot easier to stay in contact and maybe do a phone tree kind of thing and make sure that everyone is covered in that time. Whereas in a large church, if there's some people who are more on the fringe or still getting introduced to the congregation, it may have been easier for them to fall away in that immediate shift during the pandemic lockdowns.
Yeah. I think continuing on with that, we have a couple of other questions that are sort of digging in a little bit deeper here and asking about, this is the big picture. How do these things differ, right? Based on not just church size, but other categories. So Susan Valaket is sort of asking us to do this, right? Would you consider breaking down these results in our church categories? And I will say for everyone that there's a lot more of this sort of breaking down of the categories in the full written report. So like Scott mentioned in the beginning, please look at that. And we will be continuing to produce reports out of this rich data that further explores some of these intricacies. But Susan's asking, so it'd be helpful for me to see, results from mainline churches. So maybe you want to talk a little bit about how these results differ for those attenders in mainline Protestant congregations.
So I'll start with a couple and then Scott can fill in with more.
Yep.
One thing we saw is that mainline congregations are more likely to have longer term attenders, so people who have been there for 10 or more years. And they're also more likely to have people, or they're the most likely to volunteer on a more regular basis. And they are less likely to be regular attenders as compared to the evangelical Protestant attenders. Oh, and they're also most likely to have increased their financial giving over the past 5 years. So some of the things that's kind of interesting out of this is we haven't dug into yet, but as Scott mentioned, we're going to look into the motivations for volunteering and giving. And so some of the questions I have around that is, what is the reason for increasing giving? Is it increased need? Or is it a smaller donor pool and people are feeling that they need to shoulder that burden more or step up? And if people who used to be the big donors and the large names in the church are no longer with us, for example, is that driving some of this, or are there other factors at play?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there are many other points to make from this, but I do want to say, kind of stick with us over the next few months because we do intend to do a little piece on the faith tradition category differences. We also intend to do size differences, racial group differences. They're not all straightforward, and there's some interplay, but we wanted to get this first look out so that people could start asking questions, and then we're going to try to tailor some of our next reports based on what people are interested in. And obviously, these are important ones. Not too surprisingly, the evangelical congregations were more likely to have people join. The new people, the converts, they were more likely to do that. They were more likely to say they tithe at 10%, things like that. The Catholic and Orthodox were less likely to be regular weekly attenders and much more likely to attend in person than online. Some things like that. So some of them fit kind of stereotypes you might think of around those traditions, but others are quite fascinating. And we're going to play out a lot more of that into the future. I noticed one person asked about Jewish congregations, other faith groups. Unfortunately, based on our funding and such, we were not able to ask congregations outside of the Christian faith to participate in this. However, our Faith Communities Today project and the survey we'll be doing this fall does include many other faith traditions. And we did include non-denominational congregations in this. They are certainly represented as well here.
Yeah. Let's continue a little more in this direction of kind of teasing out some of these differences across sort of demographic or sort of religious tradition. So I'm thinking about the question here on those individuals who want to join the congregation through 100% remote participation, right? So the sort of the group of the committed online worship attenders, not the dual participation. What are some of the kind of interesting elements out of that group that you all find in this data?
We have to go to our cheat sheets here.
Well, one thing we do know is that they are higher or most likely to say that they're very satisfied with the online worship experience. So, that's just a little tidbit. But I think that they also tended to be older adults and more homebound adults. So these may people that you may never convert to in-person attenders. This is just how they are going to engage with your congregation in perpetuity. So I think that's important to realize that not everyone who is an online attender is somebody who's using it as an on-ramp to in-person participation.
That's right. Yeah, and a lot of those people, as I said in one little offhanded comment, a lot of those folks are not new converts, right? Or not even switchers. Those are people who were a part of your congregation and either aged out of in-person attendance or were always homebound and didn't have a way to be involved. So some of the reasons why they're in that situation are not just homebound, but they might be ill, they might not have a way to get to the service, all sorts of other reasons. But it really was a different category of folks than you might expect. You think, oh, young people are going to adopt an online, but it really isn't. The other fascinating thing about them is they were much more likely to be participating actively in the service. And I think some of that is because they were also smaller congregations that were using Zoom, and therefore Zoom was much more interactive. And the church in the physical realm was also had a screen up, people could see them, they could do prayers, they could be participating in the service in a way that a live stream didn't always allow. So it is a different dynamic, still relatively small, but a very different dynamic.
Yeah. But I'll just add on this out of our qualitative research and the case studies. One of the things that I see a lot of pastors and ministers and priests reflecting on is this dynamic of what does it mean to serve in this day and age where now we have the access and actually the quite easy access of using Zoom or forms of live streaming to promote opportunities for people that are homebound or face other barriers to in-person participation. Caregivers, right, being another category there. And so I hear a lot of pastors talking about this in our 81 case studies, and really wrestling with the tension of wanting a strong, committed in-person presence, but also recognizing that this is a need for a portion of their congregants to have this opportunity for online or virtual worship participation. And Scott, like you said, thinking through just some of our observations that we've done in some of these small churches that have a Zoom worship service, seeing people singing along and then having these results of people themselves, right, attenders themselves saying, yes, we are in large part praying along or participating in some way along with the service. And one pastor that we interviewed actually referenced in this moment of time that it would be a form of religious malpractice not to offer online worship, and specifically referencing, right, these homebound or people who face barriers to in-person worship. And we see a couple of questions coming out, right, of some of those barriers might be around religious trauma, right? There might be some other things that would preclude someone from wanting to come and worship face to face. And yet with the rise of virtual worship possibilities, at least some clergy are considering this also as an important way to think about what it means to minister in this day and age. So again, sort of continuing along this, digging a little bit deeper. Shelley Best has a good question too around what are some of the differences that you might see in terms of racial ethnic demographics. So, her question is, it seems that Black and Brown churches are experiencing a different reality. There seems to be a lot more trauma recovery. So let's talk a little bit about some of the differences we see then as we compare across racial and ethnic categories out of this data.
You
You
want
want me to start
take
again,
that one?
Yeah,
Scott?
go ahead and start, Krista. Sure.
Sure. So we do know from our previous congregational work, and it held up here as well, that majority Black congregations were most likely to be doing online worship or exclusively online worship or hybrid options. And so we see that they have some of the the highest online attendance levels. But then also there's also high levels of church activity participation, those religious education and music program things that I mentioned at the very beginning of my portion, and high small group participation levels among the Black and majority Asian and majority Latino, I think, congregations.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, and also the multiracial had higher group participation as well. The Black churches and Latino churches also were more likely than Asian and white to have newer attendees. So I think they picked up new people. The majority Latino congregations, similar to what Dr. Christina had found, were least likely to contribute financially to their congregation for whatever reason. And the Asian churches looked pretty significantly different from the other groups in several ways. They had more long-term attendees and really didn't seem to benefit too much from switching or new people coming into the church. But again, we're going to definitely do an entire piece on racial differences and similarities between some of the groups.
I'm thinking that one of the interesting things that this survey covers that we just don't have a good look at is on the people with the multiple church belongings, right? Both the sort of multiple church homes, but also the people that that participate in multiple religious spaces, even if they don't consider themselves to have two church homes. So Heather Madas is asking this question on, do you have any historical data about this? And I know, Scott, you have some out of your megachurch work, but thinking about, is this something new that we're observing? Is this something that's been going on a long time? How would you respond to that?
Yes, we don't have good data on that. The only survey that I know of is the one that we asked in 2008 to about 25,000 megachurch attenders, and we found that about, I believe it was 12% said they had multiple church homes. So a little bit higher than what we found this time. But I think your question gets at a very important point that it's a shame that sociologists of religion and pollsters and everybody have had this mentality that people belong to one place, because all of us know that's not the case. I said snowbirds earlier, but many people have multiple affiliations if they're a couple from two different faith traditions. And that's, we know, is also increasing in number. So this seems like probably a growing dynamic. And in fact, I just got a call from one of the Religion News Service reporters wanting to pursue this further because she herself goes to two different congregations because she's Jewish and her partner is Christian. So I think it happens all the time. Just nobody ever asks these questions. So it's this missing piece in what we don't know. So hopefully folks will start to ask some of these questions now.
Chris Halverson asks a question that we've asked kind of since the beginning of this project. And that is, what kind of religious switching or sort of congregation switching patterns might be emerging? What's really happened? And I think you all did a good job of doing that big picture of like the characteristics, right, of some of the switchers. But Chris is asking here and saying, my gut and pastoral experience tells me that a good bit of the religious switching parallels secular political siloing. Does the data bear this out? And referencing here that mask versus no mask were sort of a signifier of political affiliation. What do you all think about this?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think that's reinforced by our finding that the most important reason is the alignment between personal beliefs, values, and preferences and those of the congregation. And that was especially true for the people who were changing right at the start of the pandemic. So I think that's absolutely spot on, that the siloing or sorting, whatever phrase you want to use there, is at work in people realigning their faith lives to their identities in other social standings.
Yeah, so the bulk of the switchers came in those first year or two, right? And then people started to have a meaning and community and things like that drew people into congregations. I mean, the other thing too is we said that major conflict had diminished since the beginning of the pandemic. And that doesn't mean that minor conflict is still there for sure, as Larry Piers on here will attest to, since he does conflict resolution. But I think some of the sorting remove some of that major tension between people. And we did ask some questions about how they felt about the pandemic, lockdown and wearing masks. And we haven't cross-tabbed that so much yet, but we will play around with that because, again, we're going to do a piece just looking at the pandemic changes and things like that. And clearly politics and that play a big role.
So Karen Hallett asks a question here around staffing needs and staffing changes. And I think we can think about some of this in light of the changes with the rise of online participation and others. But we also have some data from our other reports, our tech report and others, that kind of get to this question around how congregations are responding, and are they doing staffing changes, thinking about tech, pastoral care, et cetera, to respond to some of these realities.
Before we answer, shout out to our Doctor of Ministry students.
Woohoo!
We have a Doctor of Ministry. If you'd like to study with us, do consider it. Sorry, that was a commercial. Now, go ahead and answer, Carissa. No.
I know we asked about having dedicated technology staff early in the pandemic, but I don't think most of them had.
That's right.
A personal one. I think a lot of churches are relying on a very kind layperson who's donating their time, or maybe the teenager who knows tech stuff better than maybe some other folks. But in our fall survey this year, we're going to be asking more about staffing changes and if the capacity of the staff is right-sized for the current needs of the congregation. So we might be able to get at that a little bit more there, but that's not necessarily tech-specific staff or like an online minister or something to that effect.
Yeah. Well, I'll just add a little, anecdotal stuff from the case studies. So over the time period, we had two sort of entry points into these congregations in 2022 and 2024. And one of the kind of shifts that we've seen that interim period is that there were a lot of churches who were in that period of time sort of gaining proficiency in their use of tech tools, and then we're kind of streamlining. And so there was this sort of early, like, how do I learn how to do all of this and be all of this, especially for pastors of smaller congregations who couldn't rely on a paid staff. Um, and then over time, there was a lot of sort of efficiencies developed, right? A lot of um, skills that were learned over that journey. And so they were able to sort of streamline, to sort of make decisions about things that impact feasibility and sustainability, to the point where many of them, as we came back in 2024, were kind of saying we kind of more or less got this figured out, right? We've sort of learned over the past years, we've sort of developed the capacities that we need. But there were some that told stories about, our two volunteers that have been doing this are going off to college. What are we going to do? So to your point, Carissa, on the, relying on volunteers to sort of lead this process. And then there were also, I would say, several out of this 81 pastors who were just like, I'm not investing in this because I personally don't have the capacity to do it, nor do I have this committed volunteer to lead these efforts. So I think it's a good question, Karen, on, there's all of the differences across the size of the congregation, the resources available, the training and resources that the clergy leadership has versus not, that all kind of impact this reality. Anything, Scott, there you wanted to add to that?
No, that's great answers.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got sort of a bunch of other questions here. We'll get to, like I said, as many as we can. I think one question that just affects sort of this study overall was this question that came on early about how clergy that have changed positions, right, have taken new calls since or during the pandemic. How does that affect the study? So we're asking attenders in this case, but overall, our work also looks at key informant or most often clergy respondent surveys. So if you would have a pastor who wasn't there 5 years ago, right, what would that mean for our data that we collect on congregations?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, because I think people could perhaps be, reinvigorated to participate more, volunteer more, or donate more, because of a new pastor comes in and perhaps changes the culture a little bit. So I think that definitely could be at play. I think one of the advantages of the data we collected through the Faith Communities Today portion, so the more than half of the respondents, we have a survey from the clergy leader of the church for those people. And so, as Scott was mentioning at the very end, one of the interesting reports we're going to try and look at is to compare the views. But another way we could use that information is see the people who have had a staff change in the past year, or a clergy leader staff change in the last 5 years or not, to see if there's any differences there. But I think that also, I think a lot of these findings would still hold up. I think, feeling supported during the pandemic and feeling connected and those kinds of things, hopefully transcend just the one clergy person, but speak about the culture of the congregation more broadly.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, we worked really hard to ask questions that were not directly specific to a particular person, except for the fit between the clergy. But even that could be, whoever's there now, not over time. It's always challenging to ask survey questions and assume what people are going to be thinking when they answer them. But the other thing that is missing is the people who have, for some reason, left the congregation, left religion during this period of time. And what we're hoping to do in early 2026 is another sort of paid panel, like we did with this one, but only targeted to people who have left a congregation during this last 5 years. And then what caused them to leave? Why did they leave? What are they doing now for their own spiritual, satisfaction and things like that, to try to get a different take on some of this. As Carissa said, right, somebody who's left the congregation, we don't have their information. We also don't have too much information on the people who are marginal participants, though we are going to try to look at that group, because out of 24,000, you have a good many thousand that are less involved. You have the folks who have had a negative response. We're going to look at that, but this first report was to try to get an overview of what were the primary results. And then now we'll dig deeper to look at some of these more nuanced things.
Mm-hmm. So we're wrapping up our time pretty soon. Betty Johnson asked a question about congregational life and helping participants adjust to or even thrive during the isolation of the pandemic. I think that's an important question because we had, studies from Pew and other places early on trying to track what's going on, right, with religious participation and religious practices within a time that was a particularly isolating period for many. And we know from our research on clergy that loneliness, does affect clergy quite significantly. So just thinking about this question, what do you see here or might speculate about in terms of how congregational life relates to participants in thinking about loneliness and isolation?
You want to take it, Carissa?
Sure, I'll start.
Okay.
So what I think of most immediately when I heard that question is about the returners group,
Mhm.
and how they were most wanting community and connection, but had the most desire, but the least amount of it. And so I think that kind of speaks to how congregations can play this community role, and some people might be seeing that. There's 22% who returned, and a lot of them fit that kind of, mold. So yeah, I think that there's definitely a role of congregations in this time of isolation. And even though the lockdowns are over and, many years now, I still feel like that there's kind of a prevailing isolation in a lot of people. There's all kinds of reports from the Surgeon General about loneliness, and especially in like young men and their isolation and difficulty connecting with others. So yeah.
Good.
We did ask a health and wellness battery of questions to many of the attenders, and we have yet to cross-tabulate that with the people's attitudes about church, how connected they felt, and things like that. But overall, the health and wellness scores from this group of folks looked quite good. And we will probably write a piece. I keep saying this is my answer, but we'll probably write a piece on those health and wellness things, because so much has been written about the importance of congregational life for health and vitality and overcoming loneliness and things like that. So that's probably coming as well.
Yeah. Well, just to wrap up, I'd love to hear just a sentence or two from each of you on what you found most surprising out of this data as you were writing the report, right? What stood out to you or surprised you or interested you the most when you were writing this?
I was most interested by the 2/3 of people who are online worshipers who are doing other things during it. And I have to admit, I'm guilty of that myself on the Sundays when I tune in. I'm also crocheting or whatever. But the fact that it didn't preclude them from also praying or singing and participating. And then it also makes me reflect on the people in the pews. Even if you're physically in the room, you might also be making sure your child is paying attention or writing your grocery list, or, the multitasking thing that we might assume is a negative. I have to check my own internalized assumptions there. But I did find it kind of interesting about the high number of people who are doing other things.
Yeah, certainly I had a number of things that I was fascinated by as I expressed it going along through this. But the one that I'm really intrigued by is that 50% of people are participating actively online, in person, in other congregations.
Yeah.
I think one of the questions asked something like that, you know, I go to all these different things regularly, whether they're online or in person. I think in some way, we don't have good data from before the pandemic, but I think in some ways the pandemic opened up the possibility for people to really expand their sense of religious life beyond one particular congregation. Some of that was already going on, obviously, but what it doesn't detract from one's involvement in their local church. So it really is amplifying the amount of faithful things they're getting when they need it, you know, kind of on demand rather than just waiting till Sunday morning when my pastor can deliver it. And I think that's a great change to religious life.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for joining us today. I will point you toward the chat if you have additional questions you want to ask, or you want to subscribe to our newsletter or give us a little feedback. Please click the link in the chat for the attender survey webinar feedback, and we hope to stay in connection and conversation with you. Thanks, Carissa and Scott. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.